Now a hearing on the alleged involvement of organized crime in the securities industry. Last Wednesday, a House Commerce Subcommittee heard testimony from officials with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FBI, and the North American Securities Administrators Association. Ohio Congressman Michael Oxley chaired the 2-hour hearing.
The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning. Today's hearing might sound like an episode of The Sopranos, but it's not HBO, it's real. We're going to hear the true stories about people getting bilked out of their hard-earned money by the mob. I know from my own experience as a special agent in the FBI that the mob will go wherever a dollar is being made. Today that's Wall Street, so it's really not surprising that organized crime is trying to suck some of the life out of the blossoming securities markets. The MOB has gone back to school and gotten an MBA. The wise guys are getting smart. They used to play the ponies, now they're playing the markets and investors for everything they're worth. When I was in the FBI investigating organized crime in Boston, the mob was in shipping, racketeering, garbage, loan sharking, and good old-fashioned shakedowns. Now they're moving from the old economy to the new, but predictably using the same old tactics of intimidation, extortion, and manipulation. As reported by Greg B. Smith of the New York Daily News, one anonymous regulator discussed what he called the maggot run, meaning the mob-connected brokers moving from one firm to another, attempting to stay just ahead of the law. By the way, I would recommend Mr. Smith's article of this past Sunday to anyone interested in reading more about the topic. This happens to be the front page of the article, The Mob on Wall Street, Inside the Mafia Stock Fraud Scams. And I think it says a lot about what we're going to be discussing today. The lure of quick profits in the securities markets that has turned businessmen into criminals and criminals into businessmen. It is our job to work with the organizations testifying before us today to ensure that the U.S. capital markets are clean and fair and remain the envy of the world. It is disturbing to know that there is an organized, concerted effort by criminals to enter and control one of the most successful sectors of our economy with the sole purpose of defrauding investors. We know about the pump it and dump it schemes that leave investors with worthless stock. We are aware of boiler rooms falsely promoting penny stocks to both legitimate and dummy companies. What's new is organized crime. I want to send my congratulations to the federal and state authorities that netted 120 arrests in June, the biggest stock scam in U.S. history. Something tells me that a lot of those Sopranos will be singing for the government as prosecutors bring their cases to court. We have the best markets in the world in part because we have the best and fairest regulatory system in the world. That continues to give investors confidence in capital markets that increasingly are the road to a comfortable retirement, a place to put your education nest egg. The markets also are a powerhouse of capital for companies to expand and create jobs. It is no coincidence that our economic growth overlaps the boom of new investors in the market. We're here today to examine how prevalent organized crime is in our markets and hear about efforts to stop the fraud. Our witnesses today are experts and can speak about battling securities crime on the front lines. Our welcome to Mr. Fuentes of the FBI, Mr. Walker of the SEC, Mr. Skolnick representing the securities administrators, and Mr. Goldsmith of NASDR. We thank you for your time and look forward to your testimony. I now want to, let me first of all indicate that our ranking member, Mr. Towns, is en route and hopes to get here for the hearing. He had a primary yesterday in the Empire State and maybe a little bit tired from his victory in that primary, and so we look forward to having him with us at a later time. Now let me turn to our friend from Illinois, gentleman Mr. Shimkus, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, and I want to thank the panel for coming. I think we, as citizens of this great nation, having the great exchanges, financial exchanges, the success only stems from faith and trust in the individual consumers. And so this, from what we've learned on the boiler rooms issue and its focus on scheming senior citizens, it shakes the foundation of faith and trust in the markets. That's why this hearing is so important. I appreciate your time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois. Let me now turn to our witnesses. And let me, before I begin, indicate to the media and make a note that the presentation by Mr. Fuentes of the FBI will include a sampling of court-ordered telephone wiretaps that were collected in an investigation and have been presented as evidence in a pending case. I understand that these contain inappropriate and coarse language, so any young people or anyone who would prefer not to hear that might want to step into the hall for a few minutes when those tapes are on. Those listening to the live webcast of this hearing on the Commerce Committee website and the television crews here today are similarly warned. With that caveat, I'll ask Mr. Fuentes to testify first, but let me point out perhaps that after you've given your testimony, we can hear those tapes after the other witnesses have completed their testimony. And with those ground rules, let me now recognize Mr. Fuentes of the FBI.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I'm Tom Fuentes. I'm Chief of the Organized Crime Section at FBI headquarters here in Washington. And I'm very pleased to appear before you today to discuss the FBI's role in investigating organized crime's involvement in the financial and securities markets. The FBI investigates financial and securities fraud schemes primarily through our financial crimes white-collar crime program. However, we have recently documented a willingness on the part of organized crime groups to engage more frequently in this type of criminal activity. And as a result, our organized crime program has become very active and engaged in pursuing these type of investigations. Organized crime has stepped into financial and securities fraud schemes for the same reason that it engages in any other type of criminal activity. It goes where the money is. And the bull market of the past few years, with its extraordinary profits, has caught the eye of organized crime. In the past approximately 8 years, organized crime's involvement in the financial and securities markets has become significant. Historically, organized crime's role in the financial and securities markets was limited to shaking down and extorting stockbrokers who had found themselves indebted to organized crime figures for any number of reasons and attempted to work off their debts through stock manipulation. Today, elements of traditional organized crime groups, to include the Bonanno, Colombo, DeCavalcante, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organized crime families, as well as Eurasian organized crime groups, have been linked to stock manipulation schemes. In some cases, traditional Eurasian organized crime groups have worked together to infiltrate the financial and securities markets. New technologies, such as email and the internet, have made it easier for organized crime to conduct these schemes. Not only can it reach a broader pool of potential victims, but the perpetrators can operate with a certain measure of anonymity. Organized crime groups target small cap or micro cap stocks, over-the-counter stocks, and other types of thinly traded stocks which can be easily manipulated. Organized crime schemes involving the financial and securities markets tend to use offshore bank accounts to conceal the conspirators' participation in the fraud scheme, as well as provide a mechanism to launder the illegal proceeds of these type of fraud schemes. Thus, criminal indictments tied to these schemes usually include money laundering and income tax evasion violations. Their victims tend to be elderly or inexperienced investigators, and there is every reason to believe that the amount of money to be made increases more and more as this type of activity develops. What makes the financial and securities fraud schemes appealing to organized crime is the size of the profits to be made in relatively short periods of time, coupled with the difficulty of detecting these schemes. The sheer amount of money involved makes it a tempting target for exploitation by organized crime. Recently, we have had a number of successful investigations and prosecutions in this area. In November of 1997, after a one-year investigation which included extensive electronic surveillance, the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York indicted 19 defendants, including a capo in the Bonanno organized crime family, a capo in the Genovese organized crime family, and other organized crime associates. These individuals orchestrated an effort to gain control and influence over a brokerage firm known as Myers, Pollock, and Robbins through bribes and extortion. These defendants used their influence over the brokerage firm to manipulate the market price of HealthTech International, a small company whose stock traded on the NASDAQ small cap market. Members and other defendants in this matter secretly obtained shares of HealthTech from its CEO in return for causing the brokerage and its brokers to manipulate the price of HealthTech stock to artificially high levels. They then made substantial profits by selling their secretly obtained shares to the public at these artificially inflated prices. As a result of this investigation, 17 of the defendants were convicted and sentenced to various prison sentences as a result. In another investigation conducted in the Southern District of New York, 120 defendants, including 11 members and associates of New York's 5 major organized crime families, were charged with crimes related to the manipulation of the securities markets. This investigation, codenamed Operation Uptick, centered on organized crime's involvement in a series of schemes to artificially inflate the market prices of 19 public companies and then sell to the unsuspecting public stock in those companies, which was held by an investment firm known as DMN Capital Incorporated. The investigation also revealed organized crime involvement in a number of fraudulent private placements of stock in several small private companies. One other aspect of this investigation involved an effort by a Colombo organized crime associate to bribe an official for a pension fund who in turn would cause the pension fund to invest in a number of entities which had agreed to kick back portions of that pension fund to DMN Capital for the benefit of organized crime associates. Charges involved in this investigation are pending trial. On March 1st, 2000, after a 3-year investigation by the FBI and New York City Police Department, 19 individuals were indicted in the Eastern District of New York on RICO charges relating to the fraudulent manipulation of securities by members and associates of the Gambino and Genovese organized crime families working with a Russian organized crime group. Among those individuals were a capo and associate of the Bonanno crime family, a soldier in the Genovese family, a soldier and associate of the Gambino organized crime family, and associates from the Colombo family. Of the 19 defendants, 17 have been charged with racketeering violations, and the investigation is ongoing. Another investigation recently conducted in the Eastern District of New York charged 23 defendants with participating in a large-scale stock fraud and money laundering scheme that was controlled and directed by a confederation of traditional and Russian organized crime groups. This scheme generated more than $10 million in illegal proceeds by defrauding hundreds of innocent victims who, through false and misleading high-pressure sales pitches, were induced by the defendants to invest in worthless stock. The scheme was led by defendants and associates of the Colombo organized crime family. This investigation against other defendants is also ongoing. Finally, the YBM Magnix case, initiated by our Philadelphia office in 1996, and as part of a criminal conspiracy, YBM Magnix was formed by an individual with ties to the former Soviet Union and associated with organized criminal activity in Eastern Europe. Once formed, YBM Magnix registered its stock with securities regulators in Canada and the United States in order to sell the stock to the public in both countries. In May 1998, agents from the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, U.S. Customs Service, Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the Department of State, with assistance from the Securities and Exchange Commission, executed a search warrant on the premises of YBM Magnix in Newtown, Pennsylvania, the organization's U.S. base of financial operations. The conspirators in this investigation had engaged in a stock fraud scheme centering on YBM shares offered through the stock exchange, originally in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. YBM Magnix was trading on the Toronto Stock Exchange, Ontario, Canada, as a member of the exchange's leading index of 300 companies until the time of the aforementioned raid at the Magnix office. It was then removed from the Toronto Stock Exchange after that raid. In June of 1999, YBM pleaded guilty in U.S. District Court in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania to a one-count criminal information charging a multi-object conspiracy to commit securities fraud and mail fraud. As a part of the conspiracy, YBM filed prospectus with securities regulators on at the Ontario Securities Commission for approval to issue their second public offering of its stock. The proceeds of that offering generated approximately $100 million Canadian dollars. Beginning in August of 1996, YBM filed a series of documents with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the NASDAQ in order to obtain authorization to issue stock in the United States. It is important to note that this plea constitutes a global resolution of the criminal conduct of the corporation, the corporate defendant only, that occurred between 1993 and the date of the plea. The investigation against the individual subjects involved is ongoing at this time. Although these investigations are financially complex, we utilize traditional investigative techniques, such as the use of informants, undercover operations, and electronic surveillance in developing cases suitable for prosecution. Our investigations are coordinated closely with the Securities and Exchange Commission so as to minimize losses to the investors once these schemes are uncovered. Both the SEC and the National Association of Securities Dealers have provided assistance by identifying victims, co-conspirators, and trading activity relative to these fraudulently manipulated stocks. In conclusion, I want to thank the subcommittee for giving me the opportunity to testify here today. This trend towards investing in the financial markets and the tremendous profits which have been realized in recent years, as well as the sheer volume of funds involved, make the financial and securities markets prime targets for exploitation by organized crime, as organized crime goes where the money is. The FBI is fully prepared to address the emerging area of criminal activity and have already realized significant successes as well as prevented substantial financial losses. And we look forward to working with the Congress to ensure that we continue to meet the investigative demands of this emerging and developing aspect of organized crime. This concludes my prepared remarks, and as the chairman mentioned, we have a tape which should wait until later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fuentes. Mr. Walker from the SEC and Chief of the Enforcement Division, thank you and welcome back.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Oxley. Good morning, members of the subcommittee. I'm Richard Walker, the SEC's Director of Enforcement. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Securities and Exchange Commission concerning the involvement of organized crime on Wall Street. This issue, though not new, has received heightened attention in the past several years as reported mob involvement on Wall Street has increased. The increase is likely the confluence of two different factors. First, the mob is being driven from certain of its traditional havens, such as garbage hauling cartels. And second, as previously noted, the longest-running bull market in our nation's history has created new opportunities for illegal profits. Based on Commission efforts in combating illegal conduct in our markets, we believe three conclusions can be stated at the outset. First, organized crime activity on Wall Street does not threaten the overall integrity of our nation's securities markets. Second, such activity that's been observed has been confined to the microcap sector of the securities market, a market for low-priced, thinly traded securities, and mob activity taints only a small fraction of that sector. And third, aggressive civil and criminal law enforcement actions attacking microcap fraud have shut the doors of some of the most notorious boiler rooms which provide a point of entry to the securities markets for organized crime. While Hollywood has sensationalized the subject of organized crime on Wall Street during the past year by making it the storyline of various movies and television shows, the Commission, not surprisingly, finds little entertainment value in the subject. Rather, the Commission believes that any unlawful activity by organized crime on Wall Street is cause for serious concern and requires the strongest possible response by law enforcement. The Commission employs a two-pronged plan for fighting organized crime. First, vigorous enforcement efforts, plus regulatory initiatives designed to safeguard the microcap market and eliminate some of the abusive practices that have plagued that market. I'd like to use my remaining minutes to highlight some of our achievements in each of these areas. The Commission has worked closely with the FBI, various United States attorneys' offices, state and local prosecutors and regulators, and the NASD to bring a number of significant enforcement actions in recent years, targeting fraudulent practices in the microcap market, particularly stock manipulations. In a number of these cases, charges have been asserted against members of organized crime. These joint prosecutions have been highly successful, and we will continue to make sure that each and every instance of organized crime on Wall Street is vigorously prosecuted. The key to success in this area is close cooperation among both civil and criminal regulators and prosecutors. The reasons are several. First, members of organized crime are not deterred by civil sanctions alone. They view injunctions and money penalties as costs of doing business. Rather, the threat of jail time is the most effective deterrent in this area. Second, civil regulators and criminal prosecutors each possess unique expertise that is necessary to root out the involvement of organized crime on Wall Street. The SEC, NASDR, and other regulators surveil our capital markets and identify suspicious trading activity. We react quickly to red flags that securities fraud is occurring, such as unexplained surges in stock price and spikes in trading volume. If our investigation turns up potential involvement by organized crime, we immediately telephone our colleagues at the Justice Department or the FBI. The Justice Department, U.S. attorneys, and FBI have great expertise in surveilling organized crime. They do so through a variety of means not available to civil regulators, including electronic surveillance and undercover operations. We assist criminal authorities by conducting parallel civil investigations, providing substantive expertise to the criminal authorities, and even detailing members of our staff to various U.S. attorneys' offices to work with on these cases and to help with the prosecutions. These joint efforts have paid substantial dividends. We have partnered with the U.S. attorneys' offices for the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, the FBI, NASDR, and our state counterparts to prosecute some of the most notorious boiler rooms and associated underworld figures. There have been 9 major actions attacking organized crime on Wall Street in the last 3 years alone. These cases included charges against at least 30 defendants who are specifically alleged to have ties to the major crime families. Of particular value have been recent undercover sting operations. For example, on June 14, 2000, the SEC, United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, FBI, and NASDR jointly announced the results of a 1-year undercover operation targeting microcap fraud, including fraud perpetrated by organized crime operating in this market. The results were eye-opening. The SEC sued 63 individuals and entities in 5 enforcement actions. The U.S. Attorney's Office indicted 120 defendants, including 11 members and associates of 5 organized crime families, in connection with several securities fraud scams. The indictments allege an array of microcap manipulations and private placement frauds. The sentences handed down in recent securities fraud cases against members of organized crime should send a strong message that this behavior will not be tolerated. 3 members of organized crime were sentenced just last week on September 7 in the Eastern District of New York for their role in several stock manipulations. Prison terms for the 3 were 97 months, 63 months, and 60 months. Working with the NASDR and federal and state authorities, we have made tremendous advances in shutting down some of the most notorious boiler rooms, including Sterling Foster, Stratton Oakmont, A.S. Goldman, and A.R. Barron. Other boiler rooms have also closed in the face of regulatory pressure. They include Hanover Sterling, Monroe Parker, Kensington Wells, Duke & Company, Biltmore Securities, the list goes on and on. We have also collectively charged, both civilly and criminally, some of the most notorious individuals that operate in this market, including Robert Brennan of First Jersey Securities, Andrew Bressman and Roman Oken of A.R. Barron, Jordan Belfort and Daniel Porsche of Stratton Oakmont, and Adam Lieberman and Randolph Pace of Sterling Foster. I'm pleased to report that Randolph Pace, a seasoned boiler room operator, pled guilty to 13 felony counts this past Friday and will be sentenced on December 21st. These collective efforts have had a major impact in curbing microcap fraud and have helped to rid the microcap market of destructive influences. And if potential manipulators migrate to the internet in the wake of these boiler rooms, they will quickly find that we have a vigilant enforcement program there as well. Finally, we have supplemented our enforcement efforts to safeguard the microcap market with regulatory efforts. Our experience shows that the most frequent form of securities fraud committed by organized crime is the pump and dump manipulation of low-priced securities. The scheme centers on the spreading of false information, principally through either a boiler room or on the internet, to inflate a stock's price. The manipulators then sell their stock that they have amassed for little or nothing at an inflated price to innocent investors. The spreading of lies then ceases and the stock price generally collapses. An effective pump and dump scheme requires that those committing the fraud be able to quickly and cheaply obtain a supply of stock that can be manipulated. Our rulemakings in this area have created obstacles for manipulators seeking to obtain stock, while at the same time not unduly hampering legitimate capital-raising efforts by small businesses. On behalf of the Commission, we appreciate your interest in this very important issue. Our nation's securities markets have long enjoyed a reputation as the safest and fairest in the world. We cannot and will not allow that reputation to be tarnished by organized crime. We've done much to prevent that and are firmly committed to continuing these efforts in the future. As always, we stand ready to assist the subcommittee as it goes forward in addressing this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. The chair would note that we have a vote on the floor as we had predicted, so I will let's recess now so that we can then begin with Mr. Skolnick when we return, hopefully within 10 minutes or so. The subcommittee stands in recess. The subcommittee will reconvene, and we now recognize Mr. Bradley Skolnick from the Securities Commissioner from the state of Indiana. And welcome, and good to have you here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Oxley and members of the subcommittee, I'm Brad Skolnick, Indiana Securities Commissioner and President of the North American Securities Administrators Association. I thank you for the opportunity to appear today to present our views. Why is the mob making inroads on Wall Street? Because as bank robber Willie Sutton once said, that's where the money is. Wall Street is booming because in the past generation, we've become a nation of investors. Half of American households are invested in the stock market. While that's bullish for the legitimate securities industry, it's also bullish for the crooks. State securities regulators have been fighting a bull market in securities fraud. From microcap fraud to promissory notes, from foreign currency trading schemes to internet scams. Is there organized crime in the securities markets? Yes, we believe that there is. How much securities fraud is mob-related? No one can say precisely. From my experience in Indiana alone, I can tell you that organized crime on Wall Street is targeting investors on Main Street. In recent years, my office has brought enforcement actions against firms such as Myers-Pollock, Stratton Oakmont, Toluca Pacific, and PCM Securities, all microcap firms suspected of having ties in one form or another to organized crime figures. Microcap fraud, some of it linked to organized crime, has cost Americans hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps billions. Unlike The Godfather or The Sopranos, there's nothing entertaining or particularly endearing about the mob on Wall Street. While we can't tell you exactly how big the problem of the mob on Wall Street is, we can tell you how to best fight it by bringing more criminal prosecutions. The prospect of serious jail and prison time is the only way to deter calculating, cold-blooded, recidivist criminals. Anything less could be viewed as just the cost of doing business. The problem is, securities cases are complex, costly, and time-consuming, and some prosecutors shy away from them because of that. But from my perspective, as a state securities regulator, white-collar criminals who commit securities fraud deserve prison time just like thieves, muggers, and murderers. Think about it. Someone steals your car, they go to prison. A con artist steals money your parents saved for retirement, and all too often they only get fined. That's simply not right. Securities regulators have been successful in overseeing the activities of legitimate brokerage firms. However, we face serious challenges when outright criminal organizations enter the markets. Traditional weapons to sanction firms and brokers who violate market regulations, such as administrative fines and suspensions, often have little effect on these criminals. They readily pay the fines and consider them simply a cost of doing business. Regulators must provide deterrents to corrupt brokers and firms by bringing criminal cases and putting the perpetrators in prison, period. The closure of one firm and the borrowing of principals does not necessarily end the problem. Brokers at firms shut down by regulators have migrated to other firms or started new firms to continue their criminal activities. As you can see from this chart, a copy of which is attached to our testimony today, this agent to principals chart demonstrates how the microcap firm Stratton Oakmont was the beginning, or the centerpiece, if you will, of a sophisticated network of corrupt brokers, promoters, and agents. This interlocking web of companies and the migration of brokers from firm to firm is, in my view, evidence of enterprise corruption, if not outright racketeering. As Mr. Walker noted today, by prosecuting the principal figures in the rogue firms, regulators and law enforcement agencies have made large strides toward removing criminal elements from the marketplace. But we need to keep the pressure on, as some of these criminal elements migrate now out of the boiler room and even onto the internet. Unfortunately, many white-collar criminals are creative and sophisticated. Therefore, if we hope to continue to protect our nation of investors from fraud and abuse, our enforcement efforts must be enhanced and improved. Currently, the SEC cannot take action based upon state actions against brokers and firms. The SEC should be empowered to rely on certain state actions as a basis for pursuing appropriate remedies under federal law. This authority is similar to that used by the states at the current time. For example, in the case of Myers-Pollack, Indiana suspended the firm's license based on the initial action taken by the Secretary of State's office in Massachusetts. Yes, Mr. Chairman, the mob has made inroads on Wall Street. To fight it and other forms of organized crime, we need to bring many more criminal actions. If we don't, a cancer will grow on our securities markets, which could have very serious and perhaps very dire consequences. We need to put these crooks in prison. I pledge the support of the entire NASA membership to work with you and to provide any additional information or assistance you may need. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Skolnick. And our final witness today is Mr. Barry Goldsmith, Executive Vice President for NASD Regulation. Mr. Goldsmith.
Thank you, Chairman Oxley, and I wish to thank the entire subcommittee for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Barry Goldsmith. I'm the Executive Vice President of Enforcement for NASD Regulation, Inc. America's securities markets are essential to the capital formation process and economic well-being of our nation. Ours are the strongest, the safest, and the best regulated markets in the world. Only a tiny fraction of the 5,600 securities firms and the more than 650,000 registered industry professionals are involved in any form of criminal activity, and even a smaller number are ever involved with organized crime. Nevertheless, any attempt by organized criminal elements to influence the securities markets is unacceptable. NASDR jurisdiction extends only to member securities firms and their associated persons. It does not include criminal prosecution authority, nor do we have the same investigative powers available to the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. While we can and we do throw the worst offenders out of the industry, last year nearly 500 of them, we can't throw them in jail. But we certainly can and do help the criminal prosecutors do just that. NASDR, along with the SEC, has assisted law enforcement agencies in every recent major public prosecution involving organized crime in the securities markets. It is the criminal prosecutors, with our and others' assistance, who have the powers and broad jurisdictional reach to effectively prosecute these cases and impose the necessary criminal sanctions. That being said, we recognize the critical role NASDR must play in protecting our markets from criminal activity and organized crime. We do this in three main ways. First, we provide hands-on assistance to criminal prosecutors through our enforcement, market, and member regulation departments, and in particular through our Criminal Prosecution Assistance Group, known as CPAG. Second, by enacting tough new rule proposals, in particular NASDR's taping rule, which I'll discuss in a moment. And third, by enhanced efforts to train federal, state, and local prosecutors in the technical workings of our markets. NASDR has a long history of supporting criminal securities prosecutions spanning the past 25 years. Our Market Regulation Department here in Rockville conducts ongoing surveillance of all NASDAQ and over-the-counter market activity. This is an enormous task that includes monitoring over 10,000 securities on a daily basis. That department referred over 230 matters to the SEC and criminal law enforcement agencies last year. Our Enforcement Department's Criminal Prosecution Assistance Group, known as CPAG, works directly and extensively with criminal prosecutors on time-intensive securities investigations and prosecutions. CPAG provides law enforcement agencies with what we can bring to the table, and that is expertise in the securities markets. CPAG has been involved in about 200 separate criminal matters since its inception 2.5 years ago. Among other things, it provides detailed analysis of trading records and related documentation, offers advice and training to prosecutors and agents, provides summary and expert testimony, creates demonstrative exhibits, and assists in the trying of cases by becoming special prosecutors or special district attorneys. Several of the most important criminal cases we have worked on are outlined in my written testimony. I would like to submit for the record a set of press releases from those cases which describes our joint efforts.
Without objection.
Thank you. One of these cases, and I believe we may hear some tapes from it later on, is known as the Mob on Wall Street case, which involves secret organized crime control of brokerage firms to manipulate the price of health tech stock by upticking their quotes and bribing brokers. In that matter, NASDR's Market Regulation Department first identified problematic accounting and disclosure irregularities, as well as suspicious Internet activity. This was referred to the government for action. After the government initiated its investigation, CPAG provided hundreds of hours of assistance to prosecutors in that case. In the ultimate trial of the case, which led to a conviction, our Director of Enforcement provided important expert testimony to the jury. In addition to assisting law enforcement officials in prosecuting organized crime, the NASD has adopted a taping rule to reduce recidivism by brokers. The rule requires a firm to tape record all of its brokers' sales calls with existing and potential customers if a significant percentage of a firm's brokers were previously employed by problem firms. When brokers migrate from firm to firm, they don't necessarily lose their old bad habits. NASDR, as I said, has also provided and will continue to provide training programs on securities issues to prosecutors around the country. In closing, I want to emphasize that we are committed to providing a fair, well-regulated environment for the trading of all securities, free of the taint of organized crime. We promise to continue to work diligently with the SEC, the states, and law enforcement officials and Congress towards that end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Goldsmith, and thanks to all of our panel. We now want to recognize Mr. Fuentes of the FBI, who has a presentation of some tapes that were obtained in the investigation of a particular case. Again, I would admonish the members of the panel, or the members in the audience, as well as the media, that some of these tapes are rather graphic and off color, to say the least. But we thought, the chair thinks that is based on getting a real flavor for what these folks are involved in, that it would be appropriate, and the media can make their own editorial judgments as to what, if anything, to redact or delete. With that, Mr. Fuentes of the FBI.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These tapes, in summary, are...
Get your mic closer.
Use one of the other mics. Yours is unplugged right now. You pass down that mic. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In summary, these tapes were made in 1997 pursuant to the MOP stocks investigation. And what you will hear are members and associates of organized crime and promoters of the stock and the CEO from the health tech company discussing basically the scheme of pumping up the value of the stock. And then later, when the co-conspirators stopped trusting each other, rather graphically, they tried to persuade each other to continue the scheme and not start pulling their money out early. And when that falls apart, they begin to make disparaging remarks about each other in very graphic terms. In any event, these tapes were evidence. They were obtained pursuant to court-ordered electronic surveillance. Therefore, they are not edited in any way or form, and they were provided to the defendants pursuant to discovery in that prosecution. So these are the raw tapes made during the wiretaps in that case.
And for the record, this case now is completed.
Yes, these defendants were convicted. They pled guilty in this case, but nevertheless, the tapes and all the electronic surveillance conducted during the investigation was provided to all defendants during the discovery process in that prosecution.
Thank you. Let me yield to the gentleman from Maryland for a question.
Just went to trial, and these tapes were used as evidence at trial?
These tapes, the defendants pled guilty, the tapes were provided to the defendants, became part of public record. The transcripts and the tape recordings themselves were provided to all defendants that were intercepted or prosecuted.
Okay. Staff can roll tape.
Hi, Gene Gordon.
Yes, Gordon.
How you doing?
Okay, trying to get back to Brooklyn with all this traffic and rain and bad weather.
Do you have a moment I might speak with you?
Yes.
Good. I just got off with Irwin,
Right.
and we're having a real tiff.
Okay.
Let me describe my concerns and fears, because I've explained them to Claudio, and to some degree he's sympathetic and empathetic to it, and in a sense not.
Okay.
You know, I know the stock is up for one reason, and that's you guys. There's no question about it.
Right.
We don't argue that at all.
Okay.
We entered into an agreement, and the agreement called for some shares up front, which you received.
Right.
And the agreement called, and then talking to Claudio on the way to the airport, we need some help financially. We'd like to have, you exercise the first two options before the 15th.
Right.
Claudio says, fine.
Okay.
The reality is all we're going to be able to exercise is the first one.
We can't be even given to the first one yet.
I know, but it's okay. We were talking about, okay, we're not going to do two of them. We're only going to do one of them, it looked like.
Right.
And clear up until right at the 15th, Claudio says, look, we'll give you the checks, but you can't cash one, you can't drop one till the 15th and one till the 16th.
Right.
And then along about the 14th or 15th, right in there, he says, look, before you even cash the checks, I need you to send the certificates to me.
Right.
So that I can cross them. I need 4 or 5 days to put the money in the account.
He's right.
Put the checks in.
Right, he's right.
Okay? No, I understand that point of it.
Right, because again, using your word, everybody's got to feel comfortable. And right now there's no cash in anybody's pocket. Guess what? The promises we have all over court, we get our credibility and things that we're doing with certain people. I have to do certain things with certain people, and that's going to come with cash in my pocket. And I can't even get rid of the 100 that you gave. I think we got rid of so far. We crossed 15,000 so far. That's what we did so far. let's get out of that conversation. Everything you understand, I agree with you, but guess what? It has to work on both sides. We cannot, okay, bring the stock up to $5 immediately. It's going to take time. We're in this for the long haul. We're not in this for a short period of time. We cannot bring it to $4, $5 immediately. It ain't going to do it. It ain't going to happen. Because every time you reach a certain level, it's a certain type of people. Yesterday, I met a friend of mine, and he brought up a good point. He said, gee, I've been following the stock for a whole year for you. He's the one time before a year it was up to $14. Where the stock now is where it belongs. And I had a little discussion. I need more support. I said, with it. But guess what, Gordon? All this thing takes is money. People don't give a fuck about me, Jim, anybody else. I understand it's you and you want it done, and I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
You need to hear me out.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I want to know.
I'm not on a screaming, hollering,
No, I'm not screaming.
defensive or anything. What
I'm not. It's just that it's taking a lot of energy out of us. We have a lot of work into this. I didn't make a penny yet. All I got is money in my pocket.
Well, you know, what you do have is essentially a couple $200,000 worth of paper that you help create the value for.
Right. Okay. Good.
Okay. And we're not...
Corporate office?
Yeah, Gordon, please.
Can I tell who's calling?
Gene.
Hold on, Gene.
Hello. Yes.
Hey,
Phil is going to call you back. But just let me tell you what's being created over here. What's being created over here is a sense of not trusting on both parts. So it's getting to a part of like, who can fuck who next? And if it comes to that part, I have to back out, only because I don't want to fuck you, and I don't want you to fuck me. So the best thing for us to do, me personally, is not to get involved. So Joe Kirkman comes down here, talks to everybody, and says certain things, which is nice. You guys are looking for longevity. You're never going to get longevity when there's no trust involved, because trust goes a long way. That's what you build into longevity. I mean, the only thing you got here going is Philip. With these guys here, Claudio and everybody else, they have no confidence in everything. They know the company is going to be good. They know everything's going to be okay, but there's no trust factor. So I don't know how you're going to overcome this and work with it. It's not up to you and Philip.
Would you like me to tell you how and why?
No, because it doesn't. You know why? I have no belief in anything you say. Me personally. So it doesn't matter to me.
Well, you want the truth always, don't you, Gene?
No, I don't know what the truth is anymore. I really don't know what the truth is anymore.
Let me tell you something. You got to listen for a moment, Gene.
Me? I have to listen?
No, would you listen?
I'll listen to you going.
You don't have to do anything.
Right.
You weren't there Thursday, Gene. You like it to be told like you are. You were not there Thursday.
Okay.
You were there Wednesday.
Right.
Wednesday, we're all smooth,
right.
rocking along, we're rocking. Thursday, we come in, we get called immediately into the conference room, and we're told, hey, sorry, Gordon, sorry, Joe, we're fucked, man. We need $150,000. We ain't got it, or else we can't deal with it. Can you give us the money?
Who said that?
Irwin.
Who said that?
Irwin.
Irwin for what?
Huh?
For what?
He says, Gordon, we can't pay our brokers. We're in trouble. I'm sorry. We're dead. And unless you can help us, we don't know what to do. Can you give us $150,000? Give us, Gene.
Right. I didn't know about this. So what happened after that?
That's what I'm trying to tell you. God bless.
Okay.
So I said, oh, man, shit, fuck, damn. All right, how do we work? He says, look, Gordon, and Irwin goes, Gordon, this is not your fault. It's not your problem. I'm just telling you we got a problem. And we can't do anything. We're cut off, essentially, and we're fucked.
Oh, that's because of Myers Pollock. They want more money in the trading, and they want more things.
Okay,
and Myers Pollock is correct. So guess what? We gave them more money.
Gene, I understand. So I said, okay, how about we give you 400,000 warrants.
Right.
Gratis.
Right.
Here, take them.
Okay.
He says, I think we need 500.
Okay.
I said, okay. I'll tell you what, let's just cut the shit. I'll send you 600 because I don't have your birthday present in it. Claudio said,
Right.
great.
Right.
I'm going to send you $250,000 worth of fucking warrants at today's closing price is $300,000-400,000, okay?
Okay.
I'm going to give it to you. No strings attached. No.
Yes.
Hey,
You speak over at all?
just got off the phone with him.
Yeah, I just called him. He says I'm busy.
Oh, I just hung up with him. While you were calling, I was hanging up with him.
What did he say to you about what's going on?
I don't really think he knows what's going on. I just got into a conversation with Gordon. I explained to him, I said, listen, our warrants are worthless. Can't move warrants. I said, unless the strike price gets dropped down to 5. I said, there's nothing really we can do.
Right.
I had a conversation with him. I said, we left here in agreement. I said, you still feel uncomfortable with us? I think we feel uncomfortable with you. I don't understand why all this happens or why everybody's uncomfortable. But, I mean, it shouldn't be this way. We shouldn't have a relationship this way.
Right.
We should either, we're in business or we're not in business.
Right.
If we're not, we're not. And if we are, we are. I said,
Right.
I got a whole group of guys up here. It's not like we don't have the buying power. I said, we bought 2 million warrants in the last 2 days. It's 60 cents. It's $1.2 $2 million worth of buying power in the last 3 days that I could have put behind the common, but I was creating spreads for the warrants. Right. Now, I have worthless warrants. I have no common. The options that you were supposed to, that we made an agreement and handshook on to do something with, you didn't go through and finish up with that deal that you agreed to, right? For whatever reason. I said, and now you got me in a position of whether I do one of two things. Whether we move forward, and he said, well, I got all the agreements together, we're moving forward. I said, whether we move forward, or whether I just have to do whatever I have to do. I have to get away from this deal, bring in another NASDAQ product. I mean, go to another, find another Gordon Hall, and move on. What did he say? I said, what am I going to do? I can't really do anything. You're not going to put me out of business. I'm not going to make these kids go out and tell them I got XYZ, here or there. I can't even have these conversations over telephone. I got to talk to you later. I can't even believe I have myself saying shit like this. I'll call you back. To me? Yeah. I can't have these conversations over telephones no more.
Hello.
Hello.
Where are you now?
Where am I now? I'm in the middle of the biggest fucking aggravation, motherfucker. We're going to Arizona. As soon as I get this guy's home address, we're on a plane to Arizona. Let's forget Texas. Let's forget everybody. Let's go right to his house. That's it. He canceled that stock certificate. There's no money. They got to buy in on Wednesday. That's it. It's over. This whole game is over.
What happened now? Tell me what happened.
But they canceled. Gordon Hall canceled the certificate.
And there's nothing you can do. You can't do that with that.
Forget about it. There's nothing I can do. What I told Joe Kirkman was I'm going to buy the stock up to $2.5, $3, so he covers it 4 or 5, gets our clients liquidity on the common. I said the warrants. I don't know what I'm going to do about it. I said you are responsible. Alan Owen. Forget what I said to Alan Owen. God forbid these people. Forget about it. I'm going to end up getting thrown in jail for this today. I told the other guy, Alan Young, in his office, you don't find him in 15 minutes. I said, do yourself a favor. I'm on my way to Arizona. Keep yourself out of the office. Because even if I just see you, you're fucking getting hit.
Unbelievable.
I said, keep yourself.
Now?
He went to fucking Texas, but even Joe can't find him in Texas. I ain't taking this abuse no more. I don't really give a fuck.
Unbelievable.
I don't really fucking care anymore. I don't care if you're coming, you're not coming. I don't care if I'm getting in trouble, I'm not getting in trouble. I'm telling you, I'm finished with this. These fucking people are not making me out to be a fucking jerk-off. I'm tired of it. I ain't no fucking jerk-off. I never was somebody's jerk-off. I'm going to Arizona. I'm not going to Arizona to his office. I'm going to Arizona to his family's house.
Unbelievable. When do you want to go?
What? I'm going to go upstairs right now and buy another fucking $1,400 that I don't even have for a fucking plane ticket.
When do you want to go to Arizona?
What? I want to go to Arizona today. I want to knock on his wife's door, kick it in, and fucking hold him hostage.
You can't do that. You can't do it. Relax.
Well, you can't do that. Let me do that.
Why don't you go with Joe?
I'm not going with Joe because I'm going to fucking knife his fudge. He took away something I like. I'm taking away something he likes.
Relax. Come on, relax.
I'm telling you right now. I'll call you back in a half hour when I got my tickets. If you want to come, you come.
Would you please?
That's where I'm going. I got his address.
Would you please calm down?
Thank you, Agent Fuentes, for that most interesting tape and realism 101, I guess. Let me recognize myself for beginning a series of questions. In your estimation, what is it possible to prosecute a case like this without the use of electronic surveillance?
We don't believe so. We think that the electronic surveillance is the most effective tool, as well as the use of undercover operations where possible, because it enables us to identify all of the conspirators and not have to rely on just one of these individuals later being the basis of our prosecution. As you can hear, at some point in this proceeding, they didn't trust each other. They began to threaten each other and pull their money out of the scheme. And if we didn't have electronic surveillance, one of the individuals you just heard would have to be a witness and testify against the other individuals, and of course would lack the credibility in many cases to be effective in front of a jury. The other aspect is it's very difficult. As you can hear, if you're confused by the nature of these transactions, everyone is. These are very difficult cases to understand exactly how they're doing it, and then to be able to educate a jury into exactly what occurred, how the scheme was set up by the subjects, how they actually make money in this scheme, how they threaten violence and other methods of extortion to carry this out. And these are very complex cases to do, and we believe electronic surveillance is critical to being able to do it.
I wonder if you could take us through a situation in which you have start with probable cause and then are able to have a court order. The reason I ask you this is because this Judiciary Committee is considering changing the standard from what it is now, which is probable cause, to that a crime is going to be committed or has been committed. That is, changing that standard rather substantially. Hopefully that bill will go no place, but it's interesting that that issue has come up, and particularly interesting in this context, because my guess is, knowing the complicated nature, as you pointed out, it would be very, very difficult to go into a magistrate or a federal judge and say with any degree of certainty and specification what kind of crime was being committed or about to be committed. So I wonder if you could take us through what investigators are faced with in terms of getting approval up and down the line for that legal wiretap.
Well, the reason we believe that the standard is extremely strict, and justifiably so, but strict enough, is that we have to show that the telephone, if it's going to be the instrument of interception, or the office, is being used to further the crime, and that no other investigative technique will work. That if we subpoena individuals before the grand jury, they are likely to lie. They are likely to intimidate witnesses into either forgetting or not wanting to offer truthful testimony. Other methods of surveillance will not identify all of the subjects of the conspiracy and all of the complexities of how the financial scheme is unfolding. We have to prove that all of those have been attempted and failed and will continue to fail without electronic surveillance. So already it's the tool.
Let me back up a little bit. And that is one of the bases for the affidavit that's filed with the federal court?
Yes, it is. We refer to that as requisite necessity. In other words, it's the tool of last resort. Nothing else will be successful. It's the only option we have left, we believe, to successfully identify all of the subjects involved in the conspiracy, to obtain evidence that will support a successful prosecution at the end of the conspiracy, and further the investigation, and that no other technique will enable that to happen.
So you have to show that, and you have to show there's probable cause that a crime is being committed.
Yes.
And that is basically an affidavit by an FBI agent that goes to the federal court, correct?
Correct.
Now, but it's not that easy, is it? In other words, you have to, from the time the agent is involved in the case, take us through the bureaucratic maze that you have to go through with the Bureau and with the Justice Department even before you even get to a federal court.
Well, in the beginning, it would entail the debriefing of informants, witnesses, citizens, individuals knowledgeable of the industry involved, obtaining a tremendous amount of information as to what the conspiracy is about, and then later becoming specific as to where those conversations occur, whether they're occurring on a street corner, as we see in organized crime when they do the so-called walk talk, where they're walking around the block, or whether it's occurring in a vehicle or in an office or over office or cellular telephones. We have to show that we have probable cause that not only are they engaged in the crime, and probable cause as to what specific crimes are involved, what individuals are involved, but specifically how they're talking to each other, where those conversations occur, and that we have reason to believe that a particular telephone or a particular microphone at a certain location will be the only way to capture those conversations.
Okay, now if you're an agent working on that case and you've put that together in affidavit form, working, I assume, with your supervisor correct me if I'm wrong, how this works. The agent works for the supervisor. The supervisor basically okays the affidavit, the information in the affidavit. Right. Then does it go to the SAC? Does it go directly to justice? What is the next step?
Well, during the first step, this would always be a team effort because it is so labor-intensive on the part of the investigators and the analysts who are involved in the investigation. But the team of agents and the case agent would then prepare the affidavit. It would also be prepared in consultation with the prosecutor of the case, the assistant United States attorney assigned to this investigation. And these are always partnerships with our counterpart strike force attorneys. After the affidavit, or while the affidavit is being prepared, it would be reviewed by the supervisor of that squad, the assistants in charge of that field office, as well as supervisory staff at the U.S. Attorney's Office, because we have to show not only that this is the way to gather the evidence, but that the result will be worth all of the resources, because other things will stop while this occurs. Normally, this would require an entire squad of agents and maybe assistance from a number of squads of agents for a long period of time. So while that's going to happen, individuals, management staff would have to determine that this will be worth the resource expenditure. Once, in addition, it would be going through the legal review, that there's sufficient probable cause, that all of the legal requirements and constitutional safeguards will be met while this is being prepared. Now, these affidavits can vary anywhere from 40 pages to 140 pages typically, but will identify who will be intercepted, who are the conspirators, what the violations are, and the reason or basis for knowing that those conversations will occur either at a particular location or over a particular device or by email if that's the method of communication. Once it's gone through all of the field office review, and all of the review in that United States Attorney's Office for that district, in coordination with supervisors in my section at FBI headquarters and strike force supervisors from the Department of Justice, then the affidavit would be submitted to our headquarters and simultaneously to the Department of Justice. Within the FBI, I have the signing authority for electronic surveillance in these matters, unless it's at a higher degree of sensitivity depending on where the microphone will be placed. It might require the director of the FBI to personally authorize it. But for the vast majority of these type of investigations, I would sign at FBI headquarters for the authority to do it. My counterpart at the Department of Justice would also sign, and then once those two signatures and authorizations are obtained, then the case agent takes the affidavit with the order that's been prepared to intercept the conversations to the chief judge of that circuit. And then the judge would issue the order to conduct the surveillance, and then would also set the order for continued reporting on the part of the agents and the prosecutor as the wiretap occurs. These authorities are in 30-day maximum increments, with reviews generally each 10 days, where we would submit to the court how many conversations have been intercepted, have we intercepted the individuals that we said we would intercept, what evidence has been obtained to date, and do we recommend or seek continued authority to conduct that surveillance. And generally, in a case like this, these surveillances will only go long enough, because they are so resource intensive and so intrusive. They will only go long enough to gain the evidence we need for a successful prosecution. And then, again, the team will determine at what point that will be. Now, one of the difficulties in these types of investigations are that while we're gathering that evidence, individual investors are losing money. People are becoming victims on a daily basis, and we have to balance the potential threat to those victims with the greater good of trying to stop all of these individuals, because we've learned from past experience, if the case isn't pursued to its logical conclusion, they will jump to another firm, reform another company, and start all over again the next day, and then we'll go back to the beginning, trying to conduct surveillance, talk to informants, and start the process over.
Thank you. Mr. Walker, did you have a comment on the electronic surveillance issue?
Only that it's very vitally important in this kind of a war. For civil regulators, of course, we don't have that kind of authority, nor do we have access to communications that are obtained by the FBI. But certainly, even though it's not available to us in the short run, the long-term value of being able to get that kind of evidence, being able to assist criminal prosecutors in bringing cases through other means, even if we don't know what the substance of the communications is, we can help explain how the markets operate, how they work. We can provide technical expertise, and we can provide assistance in terms of helping people prosecute the cases. But the fundamental evidence-gathering process is very, very important to these kinds of cases.
Well, I appreciate that. There's a great misconception, I think, out in the public, and certainly here on Capitol Hill in some quarters, that electronic surveillance, A, is always bad, and B, is unconstitutional and violates individual rights. And the reason I wanted you to go through this whole process was to indicate how difficult it is to investigate these cases and how difficult it is to get an approval from a court for wiretaps or bugs in the nature of the investigation. And it's something I think that the public needs to understand a little better, particularly as we enter into the new world of digital communications and the obvious difficulty it may present to law enforcement in terms of intercepting that kind of information. So thank you both. I have gone well beyond my time. Let me now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. As a layperson, it's fascinating to listen to the tapes. I think, salty as it may be, it certainly, I think, gives us a color of what's going on there. And my first question is, and any of you can answer, how widespread do you see this problem?
I guess from a securities regulator's point of view, I'm Richard Walker from the SEC. We've seen an increase in this kind of activity, to be sure. I think it corresponds with the growth of our markets and the bull market, which has extended over 10 years. I think over the last 3 years, there have been 9 large major cases that have netted 30 people specifically identified as members of organized crime. At the same time, I don't believe that there's cause for alarm in terms of the overall integrity and fairness of our markets. They're terrific, they're fair, and they will continue to be fair. Most of this activity occupies what some might call a dark corner of the market, a market involving low-priced, thinly traded securities that aren't subject to some of the same regulations as exist in other parts of the market. It's an area where we have to spend very close and careful attention to make sure that this kind of activity is carefully monitored. But I think we've had some enormous successes, and I think that future successes will build on existing cases. We had one very large undercover operation which we worked with the FBI on, which was hatched back in 1996, that it resulted in over 100 cases. Predictably, those 100 cases have led to leads and other cases. And the cases that were announced this past June, there were 120 indictments handed up in the Southern District of New York, and the SEC brought a number of cases as well. And again, this is just a fertile pot of leads and evidence to make future cases. So I think that we've had some terrific successes, and we anticipate continuing very vigorous law enforcement in this area.
As an investor, small investor, are there things that I should be looking for, or other small investors should be looking for? Obviously, you seem to indicate penny stocks that are seldom traded. Are there certain things that are out there that Joe Blow should be concerned about?
Certainly in the penny stock and the low-priced arena, there's often less information available to small investors, which means that greater care has to be exercised. You just have to do more homework before you put your money in that kind of a stock. There's a lot of help that you can get. Certainly we have a very full website which gives tips to investors that's available to anybody. The state securities regulators, the NASD, have also a lot of help that they can provide to investors that have questions about investing. And we always encourage and hope that investors will avail themselves of those resources.
If I might add one comment, I think that some of the pitches that you see, whether it's organized crime, regular crime, or just garden variety securities fraud, that investors need to be aware of are promises of guaranteed returns, doubling, tripling your money, in a short period of time. And I think Dick mentioned this, that in this type of bull market with more and more new investors and investors having the expectation of quick profits, 100, 200% returns on their money, that investors need to be very careful when anyone over the telephone, over the internet, in person, whatever, makes those kinds of promises. And I think the regulators need to continue to work and do an even better job of educating investors, because it's much harder to get the money back to people after it's taken than to have them protect themselves at the outset.
Congressman Barrett, one common theme we observed in connection with a lot of the microcap fraud over the past decade is that these stocks were sold in large part by high-pressure telephone sales solicitation campaigns. And we at the state level routinely urge investors to be very careful before they invest with strangers over the telephone.
So are they hitting the elderly, or who's their market? Who's the...
They targeted, it was not confined solely to the elderly. Understandably, the elderly are oftentimes targets of the scam artists and con men, but we've witnessed situations where rather sophisticated, knowledgeable businessmen and women and professionals have been targeted by these microcap firms. In fact, many of them worked off of leads that they'd obtain of lists of, say, small business owners and the like, who oftentimes will have some income that they can utilize to invest in the market. So this is not solely confined just to senior citizens or the elderly. To a large degree, we're all potentially vulnerable to this type of activity.
Okay. Mr. Fuentes, after listening to that tape, what was going through my mind was, well, how do you initially come onto these guys, or how do you find out that they're up to no good? Is it something that you see in the stock, or is it something you hear in the street? What's sort of the general area where you can say there's something going on here?
It would come from both. We have, in many times, getting referrals from our regulatory agencies, from the SEC, informing us that they're observing something that is unusual, which these days is harder to tell because there are so many, I guess, amateur investors online that it's harder to tell when stocks start changing hands whether some other factor is at play that may be legal but just misguided investment transactions. But I'd like to add that we have had a very aggressive and we believe successful penetration of the American La Cosa Nostra over the last 20 years in our organized crime program. And in connection with that, as was mentioned, the Sopranos, many of them now sing for us. And a number of our cases have begun because we've gotten information from someone we've developed as either a confidential informant, a cooperative witness, a cooperative defendant, who is informing us of a given scheme and identifying who the individuals are and generally identifying how the crime is being committed. So I would say at this point that probably about half of our case initiations are based on informant information as a result of our intelligence base within the crime families as to what they're looking at as new money-making opportunities. But additionally, our partnership has been very, very good with the other agencies, and as I mentioned, the SEC, in coming with us and being part of these joint investigations. And then they spawn leads, and many of the investigations are results of prior investigations or identifying subjects that we know to be identified criminals, and if they switch to another company, we know that they're not going to suddenly become legitimate in most cases and go from there. I'd like to add also that in terms of the warning signs, you know, many of these warning signs are the same in this industry as in any other fraud arena. So, I mean, we've always had people selling swampland in Florida. Now we have people selling stock in companies that have swampland in Florida. So it's, you know, it's still the same thing. If the scheme sounds too good to be true, if they're guaranteeing that you're going to make a huge amount of money on a minimal investment, chances are it may be too good to be true. What's happened, though, in the last year or two under the bull market, and particularly with the dot-com IPOs, the word in the media that individuals were attending class in college one day and multimillionaires the next as a result of various offerings, that's I think, contributed to many people thinking they can do it also, that they can get online without guidance, without seeking professional assistance, or doing other research or due diligence into whether a company really is making what it says it's going to make or providing a service that it says it's providing. So the opportunities for fraud really are the same as they've always been, except in this area now with the increase in amateur online trading, the opportunities for organized crime or other criminals who may not be part of organized crime to find victims, we believe, is just increased exponentially as people are online.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All these phrases come to mind. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Hearing those tapes are just no free lunch, let the buyer beware. And there are in traditional investments in the stock market, the basic premise that the higher the return, the bigger risk. And I guess nowhere else is true in some of these schemes. And people need to realize that, especially as amateurs are getting into the market. They only get a big return if there's a big risk, but they also can lose a lot. And this only adds to it with the corruption. And I don't know if we can do this, but Mr. Skolnick, you had that flow chart of the organization. Mr. Fuentes, these two guys that we have the tape on, Mr. Lombardo and Mr. Hall, where would they be in that chart? I know I'm talking to two different agencies, and I understand that's based upon that. Where do you think there are? Where are they located? Somewhere in there?
I apologize not having seen the...
No, it's a tough question.
Let me emphasize, this chart is really just a snapshot of some of the so-called network of
organized crime.
A network is a form of
But we're
organized
basically
crime.
saying, since we've got a broker and a CEO, that they're probably at least the third or the fourth level down in that chart of organized crime.
What this chart illustrated was really the flow of agents who had ties with one firm or had been employed by one firm. They moved on to a kind of a new generation of firms in which many of them became principals or played a leadership role in the new firm. And this is where we began to discover that there was a real network that existed out here. In many instances, some of these firms were closed down through the good work of federal and state regulators, but the agents kind of scattered, like, as one of my colleagues said, like cockroaches, and formed alliances and affiliated with new firms. And many of these agents could not have become principals at the second or third generation of firms, frankly, without probably some type of backing from someplace, because many of them really probably did not have the financial wherewithal or even the experience in the industry, but they were able to set up shop elsewhere. And this is just a snapshot of some firms in which we developed a linkage, many of them to Stratton Oakmont, which is one of the most notorious microcap firms that existed back in the mid-1990s. It's certainly by no means exclusive, and there are many other firms, many of which have been discussed today in testimony, that are not reflected on this chart.
Actually, the tape that was played, Mr. Lombardo had infiltrated another firm called Myers Pollock, which is now defunct, but he was operating on the sell side, if you will. He was in charge of manipulating the price upwards and then selling it out at a retail level. Mr. Hall, who I don't believe was identified as a member of an organized crime family, was behind the issuer who was trying to have the broker-dealer manipulate the price of the stock to make money.
Thank you. We not only on this committee, but on my other subcommittee on telecommunications, and I was with the chairman and his background, been at odds on some of the electronic surveillance issues that we've had on that committee. Had the conversation been over the internet, would we still have access to have transcripts of that conversation?
Depending on the encryption, probably not.
And that also goes for real-time Now we have real-time internet transactions.
Yes.
What about digital phones? What if it was from cell phone to cell phone, both digital?
Well, that part can be done either way, the digital, but it depends on whether it's an encrypted system, which most of the emails will have some sufficient encryption to prevent that. I'd like to also add that the difficulty with email is that you really don't hear the tone of voice. You can't tell if the person is screaming or...
Unless there's exclamation points and frowny faces.
Yes, it helps to hear the tone of their voice and try and determine are they saying this tongue-in-cheek or do they really mean it? Is he really going to fly to Arizona and kill somebody and kill his wife and hold him hostage? Is he kidding? Does the person at the other end show fear in that conversation so that we could say that they are using intimidation and threats of violence, and that it's serious? This isn't just because you can hear these kind of conversations, in the locker room at your health club, and the people don't really mean it, getting ready for a tennis game or something. But in our case, they mean it more often than not, and that's the part that is conveyed through the telephone or through microphone interception that email interception will never substitute for.
And do you accept the premise that even if that encryption technology is readily available to be downloaded, even overseas, to be used?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. And if I know my time's out, Mr. Chairman, if I could just finish up. We focus on the microcap markets for the most part. How do we, without closing down that market, because it is valuable to the small emerging companies, what type of what's a recommendation from the panelists here on how we can help, other than the buyer beware, and we all mentioned it? What institutionally can we do?
I think that's a very good point, that there are many legitimate small firms and business persons looking to raise capital. Where I think we've seen most of the problems has been on the over-the-counter bulletin board and the pink sheets. We received approval from the SEC last year to implement a new rule on the over-the-counter bulletin board that for the first time would require companies whose shares are quoted there to file periodic and current financial reports with the SEC. So at least investors have some source of information about these companies. I think investor education and due diligence is a theme we've heard from everybody today. And there are many, many good companies out there whose shares at one time were traded and could be viewed as thinly capitalized and have gone and grown into good companies. But I think rules like our bulletin board rules and encouraging investors to get the information they need before they invest is probably the best way of accomplishing that.
Does anybody else want to add to any of that? Mr. Walker?
I agree completely with what Mr. Goldsmith said, and I think one of the other things that we've tried to do is that we recognize that every manipulation begins with a manipulator getting a cheap and large supply of stock, getting it basically for pennies or for almost nothing. And again, it's important that companies, small companies, be able to sell stock to raise money to grow their businesses, but there have to be some safeguards so that this kind of situation doesn't occur. And what we've tried to do is look at some of our capital raising tools and, without unduly hindering small businesses, at least just put some disclosure features in so that people will be able to identify where this small stock came from. If it's restricted stock, have that be known as well to sort of stop the bad guys from too easily getting large blocks of stock and then pumping up the stock and unloading it on the public.
Congressman, in addition to strong enforcement, which I outlined in my remarks today, I don't think we need to emphasize the importance of investor education. I believe a well-educated investor is ultimately the best weapon against securities fraud. And at the state level, we have really elevated the investor education within NASA for the first time ever. We now have an investor education section, and I think that's an important role that regulators need to play, and I think we are beginning to play, is to help investors arm themselves with the tools they need to make sound decisions.
Thank you. Fascinating testimony. I appreciate your time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Largent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am embarrassed to say I saw the movie Boiler Room. I think that was the name of it. Did anybody see that movie? Any of our witnesses? Okay. It was a terrible movie, but I was...
Are you the Gene Shallow to the Commerce Committee?
That's 2 thumbs down. Is that a somewhat actual, good portrayal of what's taking place?
I think in some respects it's an accurate portrayal of some aspects of what how classic boiler rooms operated. Certainly a number of the firms that we've identified that we've taken action against have large numbers of people manning telephone banks, making calls to potential investors, selling swampland in Florida or false promises about companies. And there's a lot of high pressure and activity in those kinds of firms. And the hallmark has always been that they have to be prepared to close down and move on quickly. And I think one of the scenes in the movie showed that they had rented a space close by that was had the phone lines already in, so that if the government arrived and shut them down, they had a place to go and move very quickly. I do think that because of the enforcement efforts that have occurred over the past 5 years, and principally the strong involvement by the FBI in criminal law enforcement, that the historic boiler rooms of the past aren't as likely to spring up in the future. I think people have found, which is a scary challenge to all of us, that the internet now provides a cheap, efficient, and easy means of communicating with large numbers of people without the kind of overhead that traditional boiler rooms required. So our fear is that the challenge of the future is going to be policing some of this kind of activity as it migrates from the traditional boiler rooms of the past to the internet in the future. We have not seen the same kinds of large 100-plus person boiler rooms sprout up in recent years in the aftermath of the efforts to shut down the firms that we've identified today. Though having said that, I want to caution that there will always be firms that are telemarketers and engage in this kind of activity, whether it's securities or other kinds of investments. This is something that's going to be a perennial problem.
Yeah. Mr. Goldsmith, you talked about the new reporting requirements for financial reports for over-the-counter bulletin board companies. Are companies complying with that?
That's an interesting question. About half of the companies that were quoted on the over-the-counter bulletin board at the time the rule went into effect have complied with that rule, and the others have now migrated off there to the pink sheets or who knows where. This is a first step for investors to have some information. So we are hoping that the quality of the issuer will be enhanced by these rules, but many have decided, for whatever reason, not to comply.
I wanted to ask Mr. Skolnick, in your testimony you said that the state security commissions are averaging about 300 criminal convictions per year. Could you give us an idea or break down those convictions based on the type of crime and which states have had the most convictions?
Yeah, let me clarify. That's an aggregate amount that states average across the country. The convictions oftentimes are, I think, arise from what I would refer to as many so-called homegrown securities frauds. Oftentimes a corrupt broker or financial advisor in a community will bilk investors in that community, costing them maybe even millions of dollars. And that's oftentimes what will trigger a criminal investigation by prosecutors working with the State Securities Commission. I don't have data regarding the number of convictions or actions that are filed on a state-by-state basis. Possibly we can provide that information to you. I will check with.
Well, it says 300 convictions. How many cases were prosecuted?
Again, I don't have that number right now. I'd assume some of those involve multiple convictions. There are probably hundreds of criminal cases that are filed annually throughout
How many of those
country.
would you say involve organized crime?
Probably not as many as we really need to focus on. As I indicated, I think a lot of them are directed, at least if the experience in my state is any indication, are directed really toward individuals who are based in that state. They may have ties to organized crime, but oftentimes not. These are folks who have set up maybe storefront operations that are in small towns, whether in Indiana or Oklahoma or any state. And I think we need to do more in terms of working with state prosecutors to target some of the types of firms that we have discussed here today. Obviously, it's very difficult because these types of actions are very time-consuming, very paper-intensive, and they oftentimes involve firms that are located many miles away from our jurisdictions. But,
Mr. Fuentes, would you have any information on that? Like, if there's 300 convictions a year across the country, how many of those would you say would involve organized crime?
I would have really no easy way to identify that. And the other problem that you would have in state and local statistics or their reporting would be that in some cases you would have a conviction for fraud, but not necessarily a securities fraud. If it's violating federal violations, it'll probably be referred up, and actual federal statutes will be used which regulate the securities industry. So in some state cases you would have just a regular mail fraud, or I mean a regular financial fraud that might not rise up to be reported and tracked as this industry or involving directly the securities industry. I'd also like to add that one of the things that we see as changing and making this area extremely threatening over the future is we have had a thorough penetration of our La Cosa Nostra here from a variety of other prosecutions over the last decades. And we are able, usually early on, if one of the major crime families is involved, to identify that, because in organized crime, and particularly La Cosa Nostra, if someone comes up with some scheme that's going to make a lot of money, that immediately rises to their senior levels. So we hear about it at some point because the bosses and the capos are going to get involved in nurturing their golden goose who's come up with this scheme to make money. So we believe that we've got a pretty good handle on those type of crimes and have attacked that very thoroughly as we talked about in these prosecutions. The difficulty now is that we have companies, in some cases based overseas, with U.S. subsidiaries, filing documentation in a variety of jurisdictions, U.S. and outside of the U.S., and have a tremendous difficulty in even verifying that that record keeping is accurate. When they have their audits from major accounting firms conducted overseas, it's very difficult for us or for the U.S. agencies to obtain that information or to be able to go behind the documents and verify that they're accurate and true and are actually depicting what operations that company has. In the case of some of the groups that we're seeing from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, we have companies that are engaged in a business. It's not an entire shell organization or a complete fraud. They are engaged in some legitimate production of a product, but cooking their books, inflating their sales or their production capacity, and therefore when they issue stock offerings on one of the exchanges in the world, they're able to fraudulently claim huge profits that don't exist and get people interested. In the YBM case that I spoke of earlier, that company began trading in Alberta, Canada at 18 cents a share. And a few short years later, with virtually no increase in production capacity, they're offering a $100 million offering on the Toronto Exchange, simultaneously with documents being filed here in the U.S. to issue offerings to U.S. investors on NASDAQ. Now, in that situation, we were luckily and fortunately from very early in that case involved and working jointly with the SEC in particular to stall that, to not respond to their request to issue that stock offering in the U.S., which enabled us to have enough time to conduct our wiretap investigation, obtain other evidence. But we jointly in that case prevented a large investment fraud which would have occurred in the U.S. And we're not talking about these penny stocks anymore. We're talking about multi-millions, in some cases $100 million offerings suddenly being put out there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Let me ask in regard to penalties. All of you made a very cogent point that the biggest deterrent is jail time. What are the maximum penalties for this? And is the RICO statute the statute of choice in most cases in the prosecution of these? Let's begin with Mr. Fuentes.
Yes, we hope to obtain the evidence to support a RICO prosecution because the penalties will be more substantial.
And most of the prosecutions so far have been under RICO?
Wherever possible, we have used the RICO statute to do it.
And what is the difference in the maximums under the RICO versus what standard fraud statutes?
Well, it can be the difference of 1 or 2 years exposure for jail time in a case to 20 years, depending on the violation. It substantially increases the threat of prison sentences. And I might add, the other aspect of it is the forfeiture provisions of the RICO statute and the damages of either civil RICO or criminal RICO proceedings against them. So one of the things I just would like to add, the FBI agrees that prison sentences are a strong deterrent and need to be there, but we would also add that organized crime exists for the financial aspect of it. It's to make money, and we have to have the means to take it away from them once they've made it, not be able to pass their wealth on or hide it with other members of their families or friends or move it offshore. So we regard forfeiture and the rest of the other provisions of the RICO statute as being very important also in these cases.
Interesting you would raise that. The Judiciary Committee is also looking at, as you know, the forfeiture laws, and you make an excellent point regarding that. What about restitution? Is there any real chance that some of these people that get ripped off, whether it's organized crime or whether it's just a run-of-the-mill crook or a broker gone bad, what are the ways that people can get at least some of their money back? Mr. Goldsmith?
Well, individually, and this is really without the regulators, certainly can try to file arbitrations, which is very hard to do when a firm goes out of business or is put out of business. The SEC does an excellent job of getting what money there is back to investors. Each year we return millions of dollars to investors. But where you see the large sums of money coming back really are from the criminal prosecutions. Once someone is facing jail time, that's a very good incentive for somebody to suddenly find their bank account numbers offshore and bring back large amounts of money. In many of these scams and frauds, the money is used up, high living styles, cost of doing business. So I really think if you're looking for the large dollars to come back, indicting someone, prosecuting them criminally, you see the money start coming in from offshore.
Mr. Skolnick?
I'd concur with Mr. Goldsmith. We oftentimes tell investors that, you know, once you part with your money, it's oftentimes very difficult to recoup any losses that occur. Certainly when attempting to bring civil or administrative actions against some of these worst players or actors on Wall Street, the likelihood of state regulators recovering money is limited. We have found that criminal actions are oftentimes what, as Mr. Goldsmith said, oftentimes what lead people to suddenly rediscover that they had offshore accounts. Having said that, state securities regulators have been successful in any given year of recouping or recovering many millions of dollars for investors. However, that's just really a small percentage of the amount of losses that are out there.
Mr. Fuentes, you talked about the fact in one of those particular cases there were five of the five New York families involved in one way or another, and also you mentioned Eurasian mob as well as Russian. Specifically to the issue of the Russian organized crime and Eurasian, do they tend to prey on their own ethnic group within the United States? Or, in other words, you have the Russian mob basically focusing on the Russian-American community in parts of New York?
Well, we had that initially in the early phases of our crime problem with them, we did. But these are a group of individuals who are 3 or 4 levels above the street thug level. So while we have Eurasian and Russian organized crime groups involved in street level racketeering, traditional racketeering acts of loan sharking and gambling and prostitution, we have another group of international criminals who are generally sitting outside of the United States and penetrating the global financial network from afar, and that includes banking as well as the securities industry. These are the individuals that are the greatest threat as we see it. They are the most difficult. They are very sophisticated. They are using multinational companies that in some of our cases we're talking about investigations going on right now in a single case involving a single group in 35 countries. In our banking cases, it's even more because of the wire transfers of money around the globe. So these are groups that are basically attacking our financial institutions from afar, and this is why I spoke of the problem that in order to fight that, we need to be able to work with our foreign counterparts. We have the aspect of obtaining investigative results and evidence from other jurisdictions around the globe, hoping that they have the sophistication and the integrity to provide that information for prosecution here. But it just adds to the difficulty of obtaining financial records to present in court in the U.S. or in that jurisdiction to attack them. Also, it presents the problem, and I think this is maybe the greater problem, in that when the audits occur, when the big 6 accounting firms and other global firms are employed to examine their books, we have limited recourse in being able to go after them when they issue statements that those books are accurate. So that even if you have due diligence on the part of a U.S. investor, even an amateur investor, if they do their homework and try and learn about a company and see that a major accounting firm has already examined that company and said that their reporting is accurate, so they go ahead and make that investment, there's going to be limited recourse if in fact that not only the original books of the company were fraudulent, but the examination of those books was inaccurate or criminal itself. And that's what poses, I think, the greatest threat for us in the number of companies who are obtaining a financial interest in U.S. companies, either a shell or an existing manufacturing company, just to have the opportunity to get on a stock exchange and trade here.
Mr. Walker, you mentioned in your testimony regarding the pump and dump schemes that the SEC had set up obstacles to that. Could you be more specific as to what those obstacles might be?
Certainly. Every pump and dump begins by a manipulator acquiring cheaply a large supply of stock. And one method in which this was done with some regularity was by issuing stock offshore for a low price pursuant to Regulation S, which is a safe harbor from the normal registration requirements. And then within a short period of time, 40 days typically, the stock would come back into our markets. And this was a technique that we found that was used very often in a number of cases and investigations. And several years ago, we changed the requirements of Reg S to make it more difficult for that to happen. We lengthened the period of time within which stock had to remain offshore before it could filter back into the United States. We made sure that it was viewed as restricted stock so that there would be restrictions upon its resale, which again would reduce its attractiveness as a pool of stock to use in a manipulation. We've also changed some of the requirements for unregistered offerings under Rule 504, which previously allowed any company to sell up to $1 million and raise up to $1 million by selling stock without registration with us. And we've now required that there can be no general solicitations under that provision. These are two of the areas where we, I think, have had some success in limiting some of the fraudulent techniques that are used.
Thank you. Mr. Skolnick, you had mentioned in your testimony that you would like to have the SEC be able to follow up on state enforcement actions, and I want to get Mr. Walker in this as well. Would that require a change in the federal statutes?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it would, and it's my understanding there's presently pending legislation that had been introduced by Senators Collins and Cleland, I believe, that would allow the Securities and Exchange Commission to utilize a state action under certain circumstances as the basis for a follow-up action, if you will. We at the state level sometimes refer to that as piggybacking. Oftentimes we will piggyback on the action that has been taken in another state to suspend or revoke the license of a broker or a firm.
And this would not be considered double jeopardy in that situation?
No, we're not talking about criminal type of action here. We're talking about really utilization of administrative remedies. And I think I concur that there would have to be some assurance that due process is followed. I would propose that the SEC only be allowed to take this action after there's some assurance that there was a hearing and opportunity to be heard at the state level, as well as for a hearing possibly at the federal level also.
Though our agency has not taken a position on that particular provision, speaking as enforcement director, I'm very interested in a provision that would allow us to take actions based on a substantial record provided by a state jurisdiction. If appropriate due process guarantees had been provided, it would be very useful to us to be able to take the work that has already been done and use that as a basis for barring someone from participating in the industry.
Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Goldsmith, how is it that these folks can move from brokerage to brokerage virtually unimpeded? It's fascinating that they can do this. I mean, you're not alleging necessarily that these firms are not on the up and up. I mean, some of these are reputable firms, are they not?
Well, I think, as an example, the two individuals we heard on the tape this morning, none of those people were registered with a brokerage firm. One was connected with the issuer, the other was controlling operations. We have found that when we do put a firm out of business, when we, for example, expelled Stratton Oakmont, I believe at the end of 1996, it was a large firm, and those firms scattered, the brokers scattered to other firms. We know where they're going. We focus our exams where they're going. If they have disciplinary histories or if they come from a firm that's expelled, our taping rule comes into place. But we really need to keep track of these people, which we do. I think the point needs to be made that, particularly in the organized crime area, where there are promoters, there are people connected with issuers, there are just the mobsters, that these people are not registered with us. They don't go through our registration process.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts for 5 minutes. We have a vote pending, as the gentleman from Massachusetts knows.
And I appreciate your tolerance of my ability to be able to ask the questions right now. Mr. Fuentes and Mr. Walker, if I may. In 1970, Congress enacted the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, to help combat organized crime. RICO contains both civil and criminal enforcement provisions. Now, the prepared testimony being presented here today indicates that the federal government has brought several criminal RICO prosecutions for mob-controlled stock frauds. However, in 1995, the Republican-controlled Congress passed, over President Clinton's veto, a so-called Private Securities Litigation Reform Act that all but eliminated the use of civil RICO in securities fraud cases. In fact, under the 1995 Act, there may be no RICO private civil action if the alleged wrongdoing is actionable as a securities fraud, regardless of whether a securities fraud action is brought and no matter how outrageous the contract. As a result, the investors defrauded by mob-influenced stock scams no longer can rely on RICO to go after criminal organizations for treble damages, costs, and attorneys' fees. Don't you think that we should restate the ability of defrauded investors to sue mob-influenced or controlled stock scams using the RICO statute? Mr. Walker or Mr. Fuentes?
Why don't I take a crack first, Congressman Mark? I'm Richard Walker from the SEC. Certainly, we've always believed that private civil actions are an important supplement to what the government can do. I think, as we noted a little bit earlier, one of the real tragedies of these kinds of cases is that too often, once investors part with their money, the money can't be recovered through even the best of efforts. So oftentimes what we're looking at is a no net gain situation, and at the end of the day, despite the best efforts, criminal prosecutions, civil regulatory actions, and private civil actions, the money just has been spent and has been gone. But certainly we do, generally speaking, support the role of private parties and private civil litigants to seek to exercise their rights.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Fuentes?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Skolnick, during the debate over private securities litigation reform, the state securities regulators and state attorneys general opposed eliminating securities fraud as a predicate offense under RICO. Does NASA continue to believe this special exemption should be repealed?
I don't know if NASA's taken a position really on whether there should be any further modification or amendments to the Civil RICO Act, to the Federal Act. As I've indicated here today, I think if we're going to make a dent in fighting the mob on Wall Street, we're going to have to bring civil and administrative actions are not going to be sufficient. We're going to have to initiate more criminal actions, and because that's really the only language that I think the mob certainly understands. I don't think NASA has taken a position at this time regarding any proposals to the Federal Act.
Can you, for the record, give us the position of NASA, please?
Pardon?
Can you please, for the record, submit the position of NASA on these issues?
On the question of
whether or not they support giving back this power to individuals.
Mm-hmm. As I am here today, I cannot, but certainly we can,
That's what
I
I'm
can
asking.
follow up on
Yes,
that. Yes, sir.
For the record, please. By the way, I think more and more Americans are becoming aware of this because they watch The Sopranos and they realize they're running an operation, on the side, one of these boiler room deals, so they can, I think, in their minds, visualize how much people can be exploited by this. And in addition, I think you underestimate the strength of a defrauded investor, the anger that they would have. Oftentimes I actually find that prosecutors and police officials kind of back away from the mob, but an individual who feels aggrieved because their own family has been injured would be more likely to go out of their way and go after them. So that's my own personal experience, and I think that more power to individuals might in fact help police, help prosecutors to take steps which they otherwise would be shying away from in a public policy context. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I have other questions which I'd like to submit to the witnesses for the record.
Without objection, the Chair would also indicate, without objection, the opening statements of all members will be made part of the record. Gentlemen, we thank you for your excellent testimony. This has been most enlightening for the committee, and we appreciate all of your participation. The subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
All right, I got it.
Don't look so confused, man. Just let it roll.